Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait for one more minute, and then at 12:02, we will begin out of respect for everyone's time who did show up at noon. We're happy to see you all. And at 12:02, we will be moving. As you enter, we're just going to encourage you to mute. Welcome in, everyone. We're going to get started. All right, so my clock says 12:02, which means that we're going to get going right away. I really appreciate everyone's time and your interest in this topic, understanding and reducing toxic stress to improve the health outcomes for the Latinx population. This topic is so timely. It not only coincides with the beginning of Hispanic Heritage Month, but we're having this conversation as many of us are aghast and outraged as we see events around the country, including governors who are taking human beings who happen to be undocumented, who are fleeing persecution often in their countries. We're seeing elected leaders take human beings, place them on buses and airplanes, and then dropping them off in the middle of strange cities where they do not know, with no plan and no resources available. And so I am really just thrilled and grateful for our panelists and our moderators who are here today. My name is Roger Harrison, and I chair the Diversity Committee for the Delaware Psychological Association. Before we get into the conversation, I just want to highlight that all of us, wherever we sit, we are on native land, and we are connecting today virtually on native land. No matter what platform we use, it's native land. Regardless of the fact that we're having a virtual visit, this is native land. We connect because there is ground that holds servers and cable towers and cable signals that run underneath the ground. And as I sit here today, I am sit where it is starred. I don't know where you are, but I am sitting on the historical lands of the Lenni Lenape people. The Lenni Lenape are also called the Delaware people. They're indigenous to the northeastern woodlands, and they have lived historically.
What you huffing and puffing about? What you huffing and puffing about?
The United States and Canada. The term itself, Lenni Lenape, means men of men, translates to original people. And for more than 10,000 years, they've been the caretakers of the land where I sit and caretakers of the river of human beings, which we now know as the Delaware River. And so we are here to pay respect to those elders, past and present, who care for this region and acknowledge the history of invincibility, the history of genocide, and the history of erasure that's continued to be faced by Native people. But now it is my pleasure to turn it over to the moderator of today's events, my colleague, my friend, Dr. Monica Bocanegra.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to share my screen if I can. Can you all see my screen? Yes, okay. So today, the DPA has really tried as a committee to host some speakers who identify with and can provide a culturally responsive perspective to the experiences of culturally diverse and marginalized communities. They're really geared towards an inclusive audience of diverse professionals and leaders like yourselves, who are invested in dismantling the systems of racism and power that have resulted in staggering health disparities among marginalized yet very valuable communities. Today, in honor of National Hispanic Heritage Month, we turn our focus to the Latinx community. And just a little tidbit about the celebration. It begins in the middle of the month rather than the beginning of the month in order to coincide with the Independence Days in several Latin American countries. So my goal today will be to provide you with some background on the Latinx community, and then our panelists will give you some information on the daily challenges impacting undocumented Latinx immigrants, also provide you with clinical and policy-based avenues for action that are culturally sensitive and humble, and also provide you with a list of referral sources for undocumented Latinx immigrants in the community. Our overall goal is to leave you feeling more empowered to take action in a way that supports healthier outcomes for this community. So as I said, I'm going to provide you with some information on the Latinx community, and then following introduce you to our two wonderful panelists. So key facts about the Hispanic population here in the United States. In 2020, the Hispanic population reached 62.1 million. That makes up nearly 1 in 5 people in the United States. Most of these were of Mexican origin, and that's 62%. And the next group was of Puerto Rican origin. In 2014, Hispanics actually became the largest racial or ethnic group in the state of California. And this is the state with the nation's largest Hispanic population, and it makes up 39% of California's population. In addition, Hispanics played a major role in driving the US population growth over the last decade. The US population grew by 22.7 million, and that Hispanics accounted for 51% of this increase, which is a greater share than any other racial or ethnic group. Now, this increase was a 23% increase, which was faster than the nation's 7% growth rate. As you can see on this map, all 50 states and Washington, D.C. saw growth in their Hispanic populations. 3 of these states actually accounted for 43% of the nation's Hispanic growth population. Texas, California, and Florida all saw a growth of over 1 million in their Hispanic population growth. And Delaware specifically saw a growth of 31,000 in that 10-year span. So what is actually driving this growth? There's actually been a reversal of historical trends. So in the 80s and 90s, immigration drove this Hispanic population growth, as you can see in the chart that's shown by the yellow bars. But now newborns are actually driving that growth. So you can see from the red bars that in the last 2 decades, more than 9 million babies have been born, and it remains steady. And it has outpaced immigration, which has declined. So in terms of language proficiency, the share of Hispanics that are 5 years and older in the United States who speak English proficiently is actually growing. So in 2000, there was 59% of this population. In 2019, it grew to 72%. And this is really driven by a subset of those who were born in the United States. Given that 37% of Hispanic immigrants actually still spoke English or speaks English proficiently. Between 2000 and 2019, the number of Hispanics speaking Spanish at home actually declined. Again, this was driven by those who were born in the United States, given that 94% of immigrants are still speaking Spanish at home. In addition, the share of Hispanic adults ages 25 and older with college experience has also increased. In addition to the enrollment in college and those Hispanics with bachelor's degrees or more, all of these factors have increased over time. So in addition, the number of Hispanics who say they are multiracial has also increased dramatically to more than 20 million in 2020. So this can be due to the growing racial diversity among the Latinx community, but it can also be due to changes in the census form that make it easier for people who previously identified as white or some other race to identify with multiple races now. So giving you a little bit more background, as Roger so eloquently gave us, some history there. I wanted to just touch base really quickly on this because I think it ties into what Dallasy is going to be talking about. According to research by the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, the root causes of racial inequities include institutional and systemic racism, as well as white supremacy. Now, institutional racism can be defined as racial inequality within systems of power. Now, these systems are places of employment, government agencies, and social services, and the inequalities are in the form of unfair policies and practices, discriminatory treatment, and inequitable opportunities and outcomes. Now, all of these institutional racism across all institutions combine to create what we call structural racism, a system that negatively impacts communities of color. White supremacy, the idea that white people and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. And I feel like, that is where the America is great and America is better than other places in the world when it comes in. Our history, the history of our government, was initially very explicit in its racial oppression. They passed and enforced laws that resulted in racial inequity, creating social barriers to resources and legal barriers to full participation in American life, prosperity, and civic society. Those laws designated who could vote or be a citizen, who could own property, who was property, whose land was whose, where you could live, who you could marry, and whose military service could be honored. And the Urban Institute reported that it is these types of structural barriers that cause poverty, not individual choices. In America, racism and white supremacy has led to a lack of rights and a lack of Americanness for those who are non-white. And like other communities that experience economic, educational, and health barriers, the Latinx community experiences these despite documentation status. So when you have the status of being undocumented yourself, or for another family member, this only aggravates these barriers and outcomes. And the majority of these Latinx immigrants that come to the US are not in pursuit of a better economic life as in the past, but they come for purposes of survival to avoid gang violence, death threats, and extortion. They fear for their lives. And these are the main reasons why they embark on such dangerous journeys across borders and often multiple times. So I want to introduce you to Dalisy Washington. She is our first panelist who will be discussing the barriers, obstacles, challenges towards documentation. She is a clinical social worker who specializes in psycholegal immigration evaluations. She has provided expert psychological evaluation in over 200 cases, and her group practice focuses on training mental health providers as immigration evaluation specialists. Previously, Dalisy has served in the community as a therapist in integrated behavioral health settings and as an immigrant rights activist. She has earned the Social Worker of the Year award in 2019 from the Delaware chapter of the National Association of Social Workers for exemplifying the best of the profession's values and achievements. Dalisy, would you like to continue and take over?
Thank you, Monica. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see it? Yeah? Okay. So thank you all for being present. It's really my pleasure to join you today. A little bit about myself. I'm a first generation Dominican American, and I must say that I stand in with the privilege that a lot of what I'm speaking of today is from the stories that I hear from the many families that I have served versus my own. I was fortunate to be born to parents that had the ability to arrive in the United States with legal permissions. And I arrived over 20 years after my mom was able to establish her life. And there were many protective factors in my community that allowed me to thrive. And what I'm speaking of today is really stories of sacrifices and strength that I've learned as a professional. And so I talk about compassion, and compassion literally means to suffer together. It's described as a feeling that arises when we are confronted with another suffering and feel motivated to relieve that suffering. And if we present as culturally humble, we have this opportunity to truly understand the suffering of immigrants and in tandem also understand their innate resilience that arises from their sacrifices. When I talk about immigration through the lens of such compassion, it means that I believe we can do better to support immigrants if we recognize that they are forced and pushed out of their country of origin due to oppression and trauma, and they're pulled into their country of destination with the hopes of a better future, safety, security, and freedom. And so we know that as long as there is poverty, violence, and persecution in other parts of the world, people will continue coming to the US to seek a better life. And for us, that means that it's crucial that we prioritize trauma-informed and compassionate support that fosters healing and post-traumatic growth across all systems of care. In the US, our Latinx immigrant community is made up of mixed status families. Mixed status families are families in which one or more family members are US citizens or lawful permanent residents. That is, they may have green card and status. You may hear lawful permanent residents, naturalized citizens, immigrants with temporary visas, DACA recipients, immigrants with temporary protected status, and then it's this long list of different statuses. Now, ironically, or what many don't know is that about 62% of undocumented immigrants present in the United States didn't enter without permissions, but instead they overstayed an expired temporary visa. And this is important because as we think of the impact to different family members, it isn't just for our one individual that identifies as undocumented, it's across generations, first, second, third generations, and within families representing with a context of some of the suffering we see and poor health outcomes. So many people wonder why all immigrants do not just come to the United States legally or simply apply for citizenship. And the reality is that there is no line available for many of the individuals and families that are here as undocumented immigrants. The regular channels are largely not available to prospective immigrants who end up in our country without the permissions they need. And even though there are more than 80% of undocumented immigrants who have lived in the United States for over 10 years, many could live out the rest of their lives without any opportunity or pathway to citizenship or legal status. Our immigration system continues to function in this manner. And so it's important to realize that there's no line available for the vast majority. Many undocumented immigrants are barred from obtaining legal status while they are in the United States for a host of different reasons. Family-based immigration is also limited to certain close family relationships. It's numerically restricted, and there are some very strict guidelines around who qualifies. Most people fleeing their home countries also cannot access the humanitarian protections that may be in place. Employment-based immigration also requires that US employers request specific foreign workers. Even those who can get a pathway or in line for citizenship may be subject to long backlogs and waits. Just this week, I had someone who was checking on her status. She had filed for what is called a U visa, which is a protection for victims of crime. She submitted her application in 2019, and her law office confirmed that she will likely not have any answer for another 2 to 3 years, because at the moment, due to the current backlogs, the U visa applications that are being processed, and I should say reviewed, it's not even guaranteed that they will be granted. But the ones currently being reviewed are those that were filed in 2017. So just to remind you, we are in year 2022. And so this is just one type, but It's one example of the many issues that we see arising with these backlogs. Give me 1 second. I am having a screen that came up and in my way. So given this reality, I stress the fact that we're dealing with complex trauma that is only exacerbated by an immigration system that by default is leaving the door wide open to repeated trauma, lack of needed protections, and yielding poor health outcomes and negative psychological consequences. As providers, when we think of social determinants of health, we get an idea of the broad impact. The migration process in itself influences the risk of experiencing trauma and developing post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-migration experiences of discrimination and neighborhood disorder also further exacerbate the risk of trauma. We have to understand these factors and really stop to consider prior to migration, during, and after migration, and how that all combines to influence emotional and physical health outcomes for our immigrant families. As providers, we also know that we're looking through that lens of what does toxic and prolonged stress look like? What are the adverse childhood experiences? What are those traumatic life events? And more than anything, I think intergenerational trauma. PTSD, as it stands in the DSM, also does not accurately capture the symptoms and the impacts of trauma, because really what we're seeing is these very unique complex trauma symptoms that are directly related to prolonged fear, prolonged uncertainty, and this heightened anxiety without the security and stability that would buffer trauma and foster healing. I wanted to quickly run through trauma pre-migration, can include a long list, but violence as witnesses, as victims, war, lack of food, water, and shelter, extreme poverty, physical injuries, infections, diseases, chronic health issues being untreated, torture, forced labor, sexual abuse, lack of medical care, loss of loved ones, repeated relocation, gang and drug related violence and threats. Trauma in transit can include violence, physical injuries, infections and diseases, robbery, assaults, intimidation, sexual abuse, separation, and loss of family members, malnutrition, loss of community, uncertainty about their future, harassment by local authorities, and experiences in detention centers, traveling long distances by foot, water, hazardous train rides, and witnessing an array of things as they're traveling, coercion or abuse by adults, coyotes, or human trafficking. And trauma after arrival can also look like unmet expectations, language barriers, identity issues and isolation, loss of previously held roles, receiving bad news from home, discrimination, a values conflict, loss of economic and social status, neighborhood violence, academic stressors, apprehension at the border, fear of deportation, reunification stress that we see within these mixed status families, bullying, racism, and cultural bereavement. And I want to make sure to bring your attention back to the mounting backlogs, because the impact is what becomes traumatic. And so the case backlogs that we see trap individuals in limbo for months, for years, and there are enormous implications for families, employers, our US immigration system in itself, lacking transparency and predictability. Would-be immigrants abroad may be stuck waiting for State Department interviews, which means they are losing opportunities for job offers, missing chances to enroll in educational institutions, and forced separation from family members. Given the delays in the approval of work authorization documents or even renewals, many immigrants living in the United States have been locked out of or forced out of their jobs, or even standing there knowing that there's a high demand for workers without their ability to apply or prove that they do have work authorization to be here. Long waits with immigration court hearings also delay the protections for vulnerable populations. We know that even those eligible for asylum may apply knowing that there may not be a resolution for many years to come. The average immigration case completed in January of 2022 had been pending for about 2.5 years, and with some courts seeing an average of waits in excess of 2 to 3 years. So complex PTSD is when trauma is happening over and over again over the course of many years. And that's what we're seeing. The number of those triggers that heightens and becomes larger and larger leads to constant fear of a world, of other people. It damages self-perception and the way that individuals are interacting with others. And we're seeing the effects more and more. And research is showing us people living in the United States with undocumented status are facing higher rates of mental health problems, but are unable to access appropriate or formal care. The current immigration policy and rhetoric also is associated with adverse mental health outcomes among US citizen children of immigrants, and the issues extend beyond that of first-generation immigrants. The persistent worry about whether or not US immigration policy might lead to deportation of a family member also adds to the trauma. Undocumented Latinx migrants are presenting with much higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder than the general population. And we are seeing the effects of constant chronic stressors that are faced in their everyday lives across multiple domains, including work, family, discrimination, stigmatization, exploitation, socioeconomic adversity, and limited healthcare. So what do we do? As a starting point, and without having the time to go into detail, I want us to consider the principles of cultural humility. And that's a commitment to engage in an active process. Changes with mixed status families, changes with this growing population, requires that we take on what it is to be lifelong learners and use self-reflection and self-critique about our service delivery and the organizations that we serve and the communities we serve, recognizing and also challenging the power imbalances, really considering how we can be more patient focused in how we interview and how we provide care coordination, promoting community-based research and advocacy, and upholding institutional accountability and consistency. We can take steps to improve health outcomes if we're consistently evaluating, challenging, and addressing structural and practice level factors that perpetuate the explicit bias and discrimination we see by promoting protective factors and opportunities for post-traumatic growth, screening for trauma and being prepared to be trauma responsive, resisting re-traumatization and avoiding pathologizing just based on trauma history. And then as a more practical guide, the DSM-5 has the cultural formulation interview, which essentially allows us to cover what's the client's cultural backgrounds and how that impacts their presenting problems, their beliefs, their knowledge, and how they're managing. And then the Culturegram family assessment is developed where it covers social determinants of health and considers pre-migration, post-migration, and their lives in the US, highlighting those social determinants of health with a very close look. I wanted to share resources, most of which are local, and it's not all encompassing, but I believe that it's one way that I've been able to use in practice. And so I wanted to share that we have Amanecer Counseling and Resource Center, formerly known as the Family Counseling Center of St. Paul. And they provide more than just counseling services, including, I believe, someone who has, I forget the title, but that legal background where they're speaking to families, providing information and referral, assessing for any other vulnerabilities that might open doors for different resources. The Community Legal Aid Society of Delaware has been very helpful to me when I run into roadblocks with clients that may be facing domestic violence, may have a disability, or victims of crime, and essentially they're evaluating what the rights might be, if there's a pathway to citizenship, or sometimes even just the advocacy that might be needed to hold an organization accountable to provide services. That may be even medical assistance for emergency care or other supports for those that are undocumented. The Latin American Community Center also has citizenship classes and other services, including legal services that are able to provide a guide for families. And then our Delaware Department of Justice has the Office of Immigration Assistance. And again, that may just be for inquiries about what rights, or even reporting something that may be happening locally that needs some attention. Catholic Charities, La Esperanza, and Jewish Family Services are all organizations that have different programs specific to immigrants. The other resources I'm sharing are really just for your own knowledge and looking further into things. So these are a list of websites that I found very helpful in terms of immigrant rights information, webinars, and other things, even action steps. And then these are helpful articles, most of which I used in preparation for today's presentation. So thank you to all. And I believe I'll hand it back to you, Monica, or straight to Yvette.
Monica, you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Darcy. That was wonderful. And next, I'm going to introduce Yvette Santiago. She will discuss policy and advocacy. And Yvette has a very interesting background in her education, but overall has held various leadership positions at Nemours for the past 17 years and been a strong leading voice in the community for over 30 years. She has led numerous engagement efforts statewide to bring about systemic changes at the local community level, and has advocated for legislative and policy changes at the state level to remove barriers, address educational and social justice issues, and improve health outcomes in children, vulnerable communities, and disparate populations. She currently is Nemours Children's Health Community Engagement Director for the Delaware Valley's External Affairs Department, and also serves on Nemours Diversity, Anti-Racism, Inclusion, Value, and Health Equity Task Force to push for broad level strategy and action. She has been involved in many initiatives and committees across the state and has received several gubernatorial appointments to various boards and councils, as you can see listed here. And she has received numerous awards and recognition, namely Delaware's Distinguished Hispanic Delawarean. Proud to produce Yvette Santiago to you. Let me unshare my slides here.
Thank you, Monica. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with all of you here today. Great job, Delisi. And so there's a lot to talk about today. Kelly, are you able to bring up those slides?
Let me see if I can. Thank you.
Okay, you can go on to the next slide. Or am I able to move from over here? Okay, so I just want to do a little bit of level setting, right? So Delisi gave us tons of information around all of the issues and impacts that our immigrant families and children face, right? And so what do we do about that? And a key strategy to try to affect change, we know, is through advocacy. And I just want to do some level setting, some basic introduction language around what advocacy is. And essentially it's getting support from another person to help you express your views and wishes and help you stand up for your rights. Someone who helps you in this way is called your advocate, right? So we're all advocates here on our call today. And it's important for us to understand that we play a critical role when it comes to uplifting, issues that are being impacted across the various families and kids that we see daily. And so advocacy is a way to help amplify those issues at the highest levels of government. Next slide. And so I just want to share, when it comes to advocacy, there are different levels, right? We all are advocates in our own way. And some of us may feel comfortable advocating for issues that are important to us and to the communities that we serve. But when we're talking about these levels, right, they are at the local level. We're talking very grassroots, local government, at the county level, certainly at the state level. We have our state level elected officials through our General Assembly. And then we have our federal level advocacy, and we have our US senators and representatives who we meet with frequently to discuss issues that are impacting Hispanic Delawareans and what the needs of that population are in order to affect the necessary changes that are needed. Next slide. And so one of the things, that I before I get into the information around the importance of why it's important for all of our kids to be insured, I want to do some level setting. So many of you may have heard of House Bill 317 that was introduced by Representative Krista Griffith and State Senator Sarah McBride during our last legislative session. And so that bill did not pass, but I want to talk about the importance of it because it will be resurrected as we move into the next legislative session. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of background on that because it's important to understand that we know that education is federally protected and is a guaranteed federal right. And we want healthcare to be the same for all kids, right? Regardless of immigration status, we want to make sure that kids are insured. And so we know that children who are undocumented, they can't enroll in federally funded healthcare programs, right? Programs such as Medicaid and CHIP, regardless of what their health status is, they don't have access to those programs. And so children who are undocumented also can't purchase through the healthcare coverage and state exchanges that are afforded to us through the Affordable Care Act. And many, perhaps most undocumented children have parents who earn low wages and don't benefit from employer-based health insurance. And so what happens when kids cannot access care when they absolutely need it? We can move on to the next slide. And so this has a trickle effect into our system, right? It impacts education. It impacts the parents that are potentially working. It impacts our economy. It impacts so many different levels, and it's such a huge lift for the system that we believe that by being able to pass a piece of legislation that affords kids the opportunity to access basic healthcare coverage is a way to help level set and improve a lot of the conditions that we see in our local community. So we know that children rely on our healthcare, for a safety net, for all of their needs, right? And many times, unfortunately, the impact into our health system is that when a child doesn't have healthcare and parents don't want to, take on that added expense, right? It's not until their health status or health condition has gone into an acute or emergent situation, and then parents are using the emergency room as their primary care point of contact for care. And that we know is extremely expensive and taxing on the system. And so we know that research shows that the group of children are less likely to get the care that they need, right? Because they don't have insurance. And a lot of times because of immigration enforcement concerns, a lot of times families are very worried about seeking care or seeking services. A very guarded population, and understandably so, because we've seen the horror stories, in the media play out about families being separated. And because there is that lack of trust within the system, this creates these issues. But we recognize, right, that during the pandemic, it's essential, right, for public health that children remain healthy, be able to see a provider, and obtain the necessary immunizations. Unfortunately, in the Latino community here in Delaware, we during the pandemic, we had a hotspot down in Georgetown, where we actually had to bring the CDC in to really help us and other state leaders around how to help us during the COVID pandemic. And so why do I mention that? I mention it because unless we become more unless we become more vocal in addressing the needs of our population, our system as a whole is going to suffer. And so the pandemic proved that, right? It proved it through the increase in COVID rates, the lack of infrastructure in our schools, right, from a digital and broadband perspective, the inability to be able to communicate with school officials face to face in desperate circumstances. It enabled our food service industry to completely have to transform. So all of these things are important when we're talking about issues that we call social determinants of health, that play a big impact into our overall system, and why advocacy is so important and why amplifying our voices is critical to affect the change that's needed. Next slide. And so one of the things I will say is that, House Bill 317, which will probably be called something else in the next legislative session, because we're really looking to add some maternal child health pieces to that legislation. But there are 8 other states in the country that already provide this level of coverage that is funded by the state. And so we believe that this is not a heavy lift, for our state by any means whatsoever. This is an opportunity, for us to be a leader in this space, right? For our kids who are in the most vulnerable situations to be able to access simple care, basic care to meet their needs. In Delaware, we probably have about, according to the Pew Research Center and a study done by the University of Pennsylvania, we have approximately 5,000 kids that account for those that are considered undocumented. But we know that there would be a slow uptick when it comes to this piece of legislation. We believe that as we continue to mold it into what is going to help our children, that it will pass. And the reason why we say there will be a slow uptick, even though that this would be a benefit, is once again, it's around the fear and the concern that many of our immigrant families have, right? Until you work with these families close enough for them to develop a trusting relationship, they're not going to trust you, right? They're always very leery of these kind of, like I call surprise programs that yield and talk about all of the great benefits, right? Because it's almost like it's too good to be true. So I'm afraid to kind of venture into that space and maybe risk my family dynamic, or maybe risk being deported. And so it's important for us to understand that no matter how great these things are that we are trying to do, simultaneously, what needs to happen is a communications plan with the work that we do. So if we're trying to advocate for this piece of legislation, we were also communicating with our local communities and our local Spanish media outlets and our service providers across the state to say, hey, this is out there. This is going to be coming soon. We're working hard to pass this piece of legislation. And we want you to understand that when this does pass, that you will be able to have healthcare coverage for your children. And so this is something, that it has to be creative through the legislative process. The funds have to be allocated through the General Assembly. And, we were almost there this year. And it's, we were very disheartened when we knew that it was not gonna make it out of committee. And it's okay, right? It's okay. We know that, we expect that because it didn't make it out of committee, there's some things that we need to do a little bit differently. But there's also a lot of education that we have to do with our elected officials, and then also other leaders across the state. Sometimes people are misinformed when it comes to pieces of legislation, and it takes one person or one group to say something that goes against that piece of legislation, regardless of whether or not that information is actually factual. And so for us as leaders in the industry, it's important for all of us to continue to galvanize stakeholders and really talk about why this is important. And the other piece is this, and I think Delisi and Monica talked about this. Latinos in the US, Latinos in Delaware, we are a big big piece of the successes that help our state move forward, right? We, from an economic development perspective, from a financial perspective, from the perspective that that the differences that we bring only make us better as a state and as a community. And it's incumbent upon all of us to embrace all of those differences. And for those that are unable to embrace them, to understand why they're unable to embrace that, but also to educate them why it's so important. And I remember meeting with one of our state representatives back when we were advocating for this piece of legislation. And she had said to me, it's difficult for me to get behind this piece of legislation because there are a lot of kids that are US citizens that don't have coverage. And my question to her was, why don't they have coverage? They have access and they have opportunity, right? So it's important for us leaders to close the gap on those kids that have the access and can actually get, there's absolutely no reason why there should be an American child that does not have health care, because all of the systems are in place for that child to be able to have it. And so what I said to her, I said, I'm going to use myself as an example. I'm a US citizen. I was born here. But because my parents were blue collar workers and they didn't have the sufficient means for me to have healthcare coverage, I didn't have healthcare coverage, and I was a US citizen. But at the time, we weren't talking about those things. I said, but what I say to you is now I'm in a position to affect change, to really talk about this, right? This isn't just something that I do on a professional level. This is very near and dear to my heart because I was one of those kids. The first time I saw a dentist, I was 21 years old. Thankfully, I have great teeth. And thankfully, my parents didn't want me to drink too much soda or eat too much candy. But these are examples. And I'm a US citizen and I didn't even have access to those services back when I was a child. What about these kids now that aren't US citizens that unfortunately suffer? And we had families provide severe cases and stories about the suffering that their children went through because they did not have access to healthcare coverage and they could not afford to pay. And so it's important for all of us to recognize that we're all part of the solution. And if we work together and work together to understand our collective needs and issues, that we'll be able to affect the necessary changes. And we know that that advocacy is a key piece to helping us, resolve a lot of these issues that we see on a daily basis, throughout our society. My one of the last points on this side is really around cost and depend on the number of children enrolling and their usage over time. And this was a big question that we got over time. What's it going to cost? Well, I can tell you one thing. It's going to cost us more if we don't do anything. That's a fact. So if we do something, it's going to cost us less. And we believe at the time, if this passed in June, we would have been able to execute beginning in January of 2023. And we estimated that out of the 5,000 that were undocumented, about 800 would begin to access the opportunity to have healthcare. And it was about over a couple year period, about $2 million. That's nothing when you think about what those costs are now and how the access to those care services are happening now. And so for us, I can't stress it enough about advocating. One of the things I've taught my son since I can remember and since he can remember is about speaking up for yourself. Number one, we speak up for ourselves. And then we speak up for others that cannot speak up for themselves, right? We're a voice for the voiceless. And as leaders in the state, it's incumbent upon all of us to speak up on issues that are impacting us all. This is not just about, the impacts to the undocumented population, but it's the impacts to our entire community. And we have to recognize that. Next slide. And so I talked a little bit about this, about the 8 other states that are doing this, including Washington, D.C. I would encourage all of you to stay close to what pieces of legislation are going to be introduced in January. We are going to continue to work with Representative Krista Griffith and State Senator Sarah McBride, and we'll probably bring other legislators into this. But this isn't the only issue, right? This isn't the only issue. We have many, many issues across the board that we believe that through legislation and working together, that we can affect those changes. But our voices have to be amplified, and we have to be united in the work that we're doing. And we have to make sure that we educate those that need to be educated, right? Because sometimes it's like, sometimes we say, oh, well, maybe that's racism. Well, no, maybe it's just that they don't understand, right? It's not their world. It's not something that they're used to. And so when you're not used to something, you don't really think about it, right? But for us, like when we have experiences and we can talk about it from the heart, then it changes the dynamic, right? And that was the reason why when I met with that one representative, I shared my personal story, and she didn't know what to say. Right. And I understand she didn't know what to say. Right. That was when I was a kid. I'm old now. I was a kid. But that's what happens when you're able to share stories that impact you personally. They can make a connection. Right. And if people say, you know what, I can understand where Yvette was coming from. Now I understand. And throughout this whole process, we have to make sure we stay true to that and we stay the course. And I believe that together we're able to achieve anything. So I'm an advocate. If you can't tell, I mean, this is what I do. I love to advocate on behalf of people, on behalf of kids. I mean, that's been my lifelong passion. And usually if I post up, a lot of times you'll see a hashtag purpose-driven life, because it is about, this is my purpose. This is what I love to do. It is my life. And I will continue to do that on behalf of kids and families. And so I'm happy to answer any questions. I don't have any other additional comments. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Yvette. And this is a great time to open it up for questions for either one of our panelists. Thank you so much for that. It's very inspiring. Anybody have any questions for Dalici or Yvette?
And I reference this at the outset, but just thoughts on what we're seeing happening down with some of the southern states and the leaders of those states, dropping human beings off just in the middle of nowhere in a place that they've never been, with no plan for their care or their well-being. Just any thoughts about that?
I just think also how did we lose our way? I know it took a long time to get here, but how did we lose our way in understanding that everybody makes up this country, every single person, and why can we use those who want to be here and want to make this country even greater? Why are we, pushing them away instead of inviting them, including them, and making them, part of our community so that they can help us to be better? Anybody else have thoughts?
The only thing, I will add to that, Dr. Harrison, is, one of the things that we do here in Delaware is when we see all of the inequities, right, that are happening, all of the injustices that are happening, right, for no apparent good reason, we reach out to our state level officials, especially our federal congressional delegation, right? Because they have the authority to reach out to their counterparts in other states to understand a little bit about what's happening and offer insights and recommendations to help kind of curb some of those issues. And so that's something that many do on a personal level and some do on a professional level. The challenges are huge. But there has to be a willingness. And I mean, that's the big W word, right? It's a willingness to want to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do and it's for all the right reasons. But sometimes that willingness is not there, and it is really hampered by political pressures. And unfortunately, this is a political dynamic. And the lives of kids should not be political. I see a question from Dr. Perry around what we can do as professionals to support the legislation. I think once we get that piece of legislation redrafted, we will circulate that out to the professionals to say, hey, does this cut the mustard? A lot of times we do get edits and tweaks because we're not practitioners, or at least I'm not a practitioner. And so we share it with practitioners to make sure that it's capturing the essence of what we wanted to capture. And so we typically do that with the legislation. There's also opportunity for public comment. Anytime bills are being introduced, they ask for professionals and folks in the community to offer public comment in support of a particular piece of legislation, and why you actually support that, whether it's on a personal or professional standpoint. So as we continue to work through not just this piece of legislation, but others, we'll share it with the appropriate professionals to help us make sure that we get it right when that legislation is drafted.
I can speak from experience that really we know that so many changes are needed with these huge systems, right? But sometimes case by case is where we are getting the information we need for advocacy or what needs to happen. And I think back to a case I had when I was at Nemours, that luckily this undocumented child with a traumatic brain injury was receiving all of the services she needed. But as we were thinking ahead, we knew that she would age out. And that meant that she would have no access to services as an adult with disabilities. And so there were countless calls and literally saying, I can't give up on this family. And so it was partnerships with the school system, children, youth, and families, because that's how severe the disability was, that the child could not safely be at home, not because the mom couldn't care for her, but because really they were both undocumented, they were going without the services they needed. But fast forward, by simply saying, I'll do the best I can, we'll continue to ask for added resources, we'll continue to ask questions. If one door closes, we'll ask another. At the end of it all, and before I left Nemours, a status I didn't know existed is what ended up saving, I guess, this family, and it was special immigrant juvenile status. And so this individual is now 22. Remember I told you the long backlog, so she is now a legal permanent resident. Granted, she's still waiting for that green card. That means she still does not have Social Security benefits, but within 2 or 3 years, she will be able to apply for that benefit. And meanwhile, she was able to access the medical care and honestly residential program, long-term residential program that she needed to improve her quality of life. So I just encourage you within your individual organizations, and even if it's case by case, to continue speaking for those that don't have a voice and wouldn't even know to ask for more. The way that community legal aid was able to inform me of what might be available for this family, we're busy, but sometimes that added call or added question for the family really allows us to step in a way that easily they would have gone without that support.
Does anyone have any other questions?
Well, the only thing I will add is this. We just went through an election. It was the primaries. Was that this? It was already this. It was a few days ago. My God, it already seems like it was a month ago. It was just a few days ago, right? I can't stress enough how important it is to vote. These local elections are critical. And I will say the local elections, right, affect our local and state government officials. These are the ones that are going to be voting and writing and passing legislation that impact the issues that we're talking about here today. And if they're not doing their job, because they're elected by the people for the people, right? We elect them because we want them to do something on behalf of us that's important to us and that's going to help us. And if they're not doing that, exercise your right to vote and make sure, hold your state reps, your local state senators, hold them accountable. Find out what they're doing, right? Because if you don't educate yourself on what they're doing, you're not going to be able to make an informed decision when it's time to go to the polling booth. So in November, I think it's November 8th, if I'm not mistaken, is election day. get to know who your state senator and state representative is, or your local city or county council person. Figure out what issues they've been fighting for on behalf of your community. And if it doesn't align with what you would like to see, make sure you amplify your voice at that voting booth.
Absolutely. And I
Absolutely.
recognize that we are at time. And so just want to express my gratitude to Dr. Bocanegra for moderating, to Yvette Santiago, to Dilcy Washington for just bringing your passion, your powerful perspectives, to Dr. Danica Perry, who was instrumental in organizing this panel of experts, to the entire diversity committee, and finally, to all of you who took the time to share space with us. There is a lot more coming from the Delaware Psychological Association as we tackle these tough issues. So watch your emails, and we'll share space again soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.